go, record on.
Hi, my name is Lynn Foy, and I consider myself to be a Gallo-Mediterranean polytheist, and it was a long road to get here. I have not been that active on Gaul chat. I have limited bandwidth for servers, and I find the Gaul chat one to be really interesting, but also really, really high traffic. And so I'm around on Discord on some other servers. I'm around on the Lancy Sky server. I'm around on the once had been Koru server. I'm around, but I tend to be on Gaul chat less. I have been on the Septanii Reutei one more often as far as Gaulish specific servers. So I have been doing Gaulish polytheism for over a dozen years now. I started out when I was visiting France in 2008, and it was a completely, I am doing a vacation. I am not trying to go on a pilgrimage. I am not trying to do anything spiritual, but hey, I studied all this stuff and I'm going to just I've got to do due diligence and go look at the Celtic stuff in the museums because, you know, I've studied Gallo-British stuff. I mean, Romano-British stuff enough. I can't be here and not look. So my background is that I started off as a Welsh polytheist, as the name Flynn might indicate, and it didn't stick. I looked around at a lot of different things when that didn't stick, and it wasn't until this visit that I got snatched up by some gods who decided to follow me home. And it has, you know, made my life an amazing, wonderful, great thing. And I would never change them for anything, even though it took me a very long time to find where I belonged. I describe myself as a mystic pilgrim scholar, which means that all of these things very much inform one another in how I develop my work. I'll go someplace, I'll experience something, I'll do research, I will, you know, do meditatory trance, and I will, you know, develop on from there. So while my practice is very grounded in a lot of historical knowledge, a lot of it is speculative practice. It's developed in the modern day based on things that are plausible, based on knowledge, but are not attested. So I'm not going to pretend that I have anything like a Reconstructionist practice. It is very much one based on gnosis, but it is based on extensive, heavily researched gnosis. So it's most as plausible. And sometimes I get these little nuggets where something that I've determined through trance or conversation with gods is true, which is always, you know, really nice to see, like, oh wow, there is this attestation that this thing happened that I had been wondering about for years, and now there's proof. And I'm very happy that my radar is actually, you know, on tune. So the Gauls had relationships with multiple other Mediterranean cultures centuries before Julius Caesar's invasion and conquest of Transalpine Gaul in the 50s BCE, primarily Phoenicia and Carthage, Etruria, and Greece. I've adopted the term Gallo-Mediterranean to describe the practice I've developed exploring this subject as a devotional polytheist. The prefix Gallo emphasizes the primary focus on the Gaulish aspects of material under discussion, while a generalized Mediterranean makes space to explore multiple outside cultural influences while also preventing any particular one from dominating. The term Gallo-Mediterranean includes the influence of Rome with that of the other cultures listed above, while emphasizing it is one of multiple components and not the dominant one. Owen and I have been in conversation about this since 2013 when we did a presentation together on Gaulish polytheism at Pantheacon. And I will say that his presentation yesterday was brilliant and that I can't argue any of his points. He did an excellent job of summarizing all the reasons why we should not dismiss Rome and just consider them evil. I nonetheless am not as fond of them as I am of other Mediterranean cultural influences. he is entirely correct when he says that we cannot remove classical influence altogether from our Gaulish materials, because what we have that isn't Roman influenced is largely influenced by other cultures from the Mediterranean. Let's see. The influence of the Etruscans, Greeks, and Carthaginians on Gaulish cultures was subtle, gradual, and voluntary, based in significant part on trade. In regions of Gaul that were a part of this trading network, syncretism in iconography, deities, and practices was underway long before the Roman conquest of Transalpine Gaul and its suppression of the native Druidic public religious practices. Generations of Gaulish artisans had opportunities to observe, experiment with, and adapt concepts, such as humaniform deity representations, to local tastes, which led to the retention of a more natively driven aesthetic as the Roman political culture took over. The Gaulish decisions to pick and choose what they found appealing is dramatically apparent. And again, I support Owen's assertion that the Gallo-Romans were largely Gaulish peoples who chose to adopt things from the Romans voluntarily. It is definitely not a case of jackbooted thugs, as he said. The people who made these changes were indeed Gaulish people. But I prefer to look at what the people in the trade quarters found interesting when it was just them deciding what was appealing to them, and not there is another culture who is coming in who is in charge. This means that I have a very specific area, but I can't say it's based on tribe. I work with materials mostly in the Rhone-Saône trade corridor that connects up with the Rhine as well. And it goes pretty much, you know, as a trading empire. I work with materials from Proto-Etruscans trading with salt with the Hallstatt people in the Alps in Cisalpine Gaul. And the end of my period that I study is 400 CE, which is when the final prescriptions on pagan religious practice in any form whatsoever. It's a few years after Theodosius imposed that. It was actually something like 396, but I find it much easier to say, oh, I cover around 800 BCE to 400 CE, and you know, really 1200 years is enough. So just to give some timelines of the differences here, Phoenician and Etruscan civilizations established trade with Gaulish tribes in around the 800s BCE. Rome is founded 753 BCE. In 600 BCE, the Greeks found Massalia, which is now the city of Marseille, on the southern coast of Gaul. Greeks subsequently found a whole lot of other little cities, but Massilia was really the mother city of them all. In 440 BC, the Celtic tribes invade and settle in northern Italy, creating Cisalpine Gaul, displacing Etruscans. And to be clear, Etruria itself is south of the Po River Valley, which is what basically defines Cisalpine Gaul. The Etruscan cities such as Bologna, which was Etruscan and then was taken over by the Gauls, named after the boy Bologna. It was a colony. So these city-states, rather than overcultures, were sending out colonies all over the place. So Etruria, while it was based in what is now Tuscany, had cities up in the Po River Valley, which clashed with the Celts. They had cities down in the Bay of Naples area, which clashed with the Greeks. And these were all independent projects set up by different city-states. It wasn't we are going to establish an Etruscan presence in this area. It was very much, this city decided to send out some settlers to see if they could grab some land. And that's the same of Massilia. That's the same of basically all the cities founded this time by different cultures. They're described as Greek or Etruscan, but really they're very much more localized outposts of a specific city-state hegemony. We need to be careful to emphasize that because of our much more recent ideas of what colonization means as far as Western civilizations in the past several hundred years, to say that it is not a civilization. This is not India being conquered by the British Empire to make them civilized. These are wildcat outposts of people who didn't have any place else to go. They were second sons. They were, convicts. It's more like Australia. No offense to Australians, but talking about where it started, it's more like the Wild West, like if anybody has watched Deadwood, that was very much the type of civilization, the type of colonization we're talking about. Nobody was out there to bring greater elements of civilization. They were out there to make a buck. So we should not romanticize the idea of colonization in this era, and we should not conflate it with colonization in the past few centuries either. So Greeks come and found a territory on Gaulish land. Celtic tribes come and take it away from Etruscans. The Celts sack Rome. And that is a very interesting diplomatic discussion that is more complicated than I feel like Owen gave it credit for yesterday. He had a large presentation to cover, but someday I will talk more about how that is not as dramatically savage as depicted. 200 BCE, Rome conquers Cisalpine Gaul. 120 BCE, Massalia, threatened by Gauls, requests backup from Rome and pays with territory. Isn't this always the way with Rome? 118 BCE, Rome founds its first province, or really colony, in southern Gaul. And 58 BCE, Caesar initiates the Gallic wars on behalf of Rome. So the Gauls in general, specific tribes had contact with multiple non-Roman Mediterranean cultures for about 400 years prior to first contact with Rome. And almost another 275 years passes before Rome gets a territorial foothold in Transalpine Gaul. And another 60 years before Caesar launches the attack on the rest of the Gaulish tribes, subduing the majority of continental Celtic tribes. That's more than 700 years of independent Gaulish Mediterranean contact before full Roman conquest. 700 years is a long time, and I think that we don't necessarily give this time period a lot of credit. So there was a lot of conflict among the cultures that were interacting with Gaul before Roman involvement. As I mentioned, in the 1800s and 700s, Phoenician and Carthaginian and Etruscan civilizations dominate the trade in the Western Mediterranean. Greeks report Etruscans as pirates. The Tyrrhenian Sea, which is the sea that is between Corsica and Sardinia and mainland Italy on the west coast, is named after the Etruscans because the Greeks call them the Tyrrhenians. So the Tyrrhenian Sea, they owned that territory pretty much. And then in the mid 700s BCE, Magna Graecia develops, with various Greek hegemonies founding colonies on the Italian mainland and Sicily, competing with the Etruscan and Carthaginian colonies also being founded in these regions. Now, in 600 BCE or so, Phocaian Greeks found the city of Massalia on the southern coast of Gaul. Now, Phocaea was a city that was in Anatolia, actually. It was not in the Greek archipelago, but it was Greek culturally. And about 40 years later, they found another colony on Corsica named Eulalia. And this was not popular with the Etruscans, who previously had been cheerfully mining and collecting all the valuable goods from Corsica and trading them around. So there was elbowing here. There were other Greek colonies in southern Italy that were fighting with Etruscans there. For instance, Pompeii was founded by Etruscans. And there were real problems between Cumae, which was founded by the Greeks, and the Etruscans. And so they had multiple cities. Capua was founded by the Etruscans. Naples was founded, or Neapolis was founded by the Greeks. There's a real tit for tat mosaic of cities that are founded in Campania that are distracting some of the Etruscan city-states because they've got territories in Campania, they've got some of them up in the Po Valley, they've been expanding a lot, and now all of a sudden they're getting picked at by the Greeks in all these different areas. And then in 546 BCE, the city of Phocaea falls to Cyrus the Great of Persia, which means that the survivors emigrate out to Massalia and Eulalia. So suddenly there is a big population boom, and the conflict between the Greek settlers in the, let's say, southern Gaulish Mediterranean zone is suddenly spiking. And in less than 10 years, a big naval battle took place between the Greeks and a Carthaginian and Etruscan alliance. And it was a critical turning point. The Etruscans and Carthaginians, they lost the battle, but they retook territory because it was, I'm reluctant to say a Pyrrhic victory because that's an anachronistic term. Pyrrhus had not fought yet, but the Greeks had lost so dramatically that that they had to give up Corsica. But there's fighting in Sicily between the Greek settlements and the Carthaginian settlements there. There's fighting in Campania between the Greeks and the Etruscans there. There's fighting in northern Italy, the Po River Valley, aka Cisalpine Gaul, between the Etruscans and the Gauls. There's just fighting breaking out all over, and the Phoenicians, Carthaginians, and the Etruscans just pulled back from France. And aside from, traders might have still been working there, but there was no military might behind it. Trade really much became very dominated by the Greeks in the Rhone-Saône River valleys. As just a side note, an entertaining little story to me. So part of what happened as a result of the Battle of Eulalia is that Etruscans conquered a number of Greeks, and they stoned them alive. That's not funny. I agree, but then bad things started happening to them. And when they did their divination, as Etruscans were known to be great diviners, they could not find an answer to what to do about this, because Etruscans, their divination will tell them what is true. It won't tell them how to impact events. So the Etruscans sent off to Delphi to find out what they could do to alleviate this curse from having stoned the Greek sailors. And eventually, Delphi did give them an answer, and they apparently sorted it out. But the idea that the Etruscan diviners, their techniques weren't working for this question, so they're just going to outsource to Delphi is terribly entertaining to me. So the Greeks are in charge in as far as different cultures cooperating in, interacting with the Gauls. And this is Greek sculpture, right? Well, this is classical Greek sculpture. This is what really influenced the Romans very heavily, as we know. But this wasn't the Greek sculpture that was in Gaul that the Greeks had brought there. It isn't the Etruscan sculpture. It's an older era of sculpture. So while this is what we might think of as Greek sculpture, it's not the relevant one when we are looking at what was influencing the Gauls. There are three stylistic periods of ancient Greek sculpture. The Archaic, which is from about 650 to 480 BCE. The Classical, shown previously, which was from 480 to 323 BCE. And the Hellenistic, which is basically what happens after Alexander's conquests. And Greek culture gets spread out around all the territories that he conquered, which is about 323 BCE to 31 CE. And while classical and Hellenistic works would have been imported, the most influential style would have been what the Greek settlers brought with them on arrival, the Archaic. So they would have brought art from this style, but more importantly, they would have brought artisans from this style, especially when Phocaea fell. The artisans would have all gone to Marseille, they would have gone to Eulalia, they would have gone to all of these places, little towns settled on the Gaulish coast, Fréjus and modern Fréjus and Nice and all these other towns, and they would have sculptors that were turning out this kind of art. And as you can see, this is much more stylized art. It has been influenced by Egyptian standards. It's very much, it's an impersonal art. These are representative. These are not individuals that you see as you see with Greek, where you know, the classical art, they really seem to be individual people. This is, you know, Venus who is getting out of her bath, and this is a very particular Venus. You know, she maybe goes and has some pomegranate juice afterwards and gets fanned or whatever, but she has a story. There's a story before this and there's a story after this. She is an individual. Whereas here, it's very much archetypal. Now, the Etruscans were also very heavily influenced by Greek art. The best way I've heard it put is that the Etruscans really loved their gods, but they found the Greek stories and art very compelling. So Etruscan, before the 70s, the idea with Etruscans is that they would be looked at as copying Greek art wrong. Like, they didn't really understand what was happening. There were all these differences between the Greek versions and the Etruscan versions, and the Etruscans were less civilized people, so they must just have misunderstood. And since that time, there's become a very much more sophisticated viewpoint where the Etruscans adopted the parts of Greek art and myth that they liked and that were in tune with their society. And they left out the things about Greek art that they didn't resonate with. And they added stuff to the Greek art base that was relevant to them. So really, even though we don't have written information from the Etruscans, we can determine a great deal about fine differences between their views of the gods and the Greek views of the gods by looking at the iconography on particularly mirrors, but statues, etc. So here is a large late archaic terracotta statue of Zeus and Ganymede from Olympia. And here is Aplu, which is the Etruscan name of Apollo of Veii, circa 510 BCE. So these are both terracotta statues. And we can definitely see that there is big influence of Greek on Etruscan. here, but the Etruscan is nonetheless distinctive. I apologize very much for not having more slides of Etruscan art. I also am going to apologize now for the fact that this presentation isn't going to exactly meet the description that I wrote a few weeks ago, because I always find that things change as I go along in research. So yes, more Etruscan some other time. I am always happy to talk about Etruscan stuff. But right now we're going to talk about how these archaic standards of art were demonstrably adopted by Gauls. So these are some offerings from the temple at the sources of the Seine, the temple of the goddess Sequona. And as you can tell, these are actually probably made after the Roman conquest, but when you look at them, you see the earlier stylistic version of representation that one presumes had been in the area up till then. Certainly, this was not the style of Roman art when these were made, as far as what Rome would consider Roman art. Here is a statue of Sequona that now stands at the sources of the Seine. And the body is based on the body of an actual statue found at the site, which is over on the right part of the screen. And the head is missing on this statue, so they reconstructed it from similar materials, such as these are both pieces of, these heads are both pieces of art that were found at the site of Sequona. So those obviously went to creating the Gaulish styled head of the Sequona statue. And again, you can see how these particular images are very related to older styles of Mediterranean art. Here we have two representations of Minerva. We have one from, let's see, from the museum at Dijon. We have one from the museum at Châtillon-sur-Seine, and we have the traditional head of Minerva from Bath. So again, you can see that there is similarity between them and yet distinctiveness. This is what really blew my mind. This is what brought me into the whole Gaulish thing to begin with. I had gone to the little archaeological museum in Dijon, which basically has the entirety of the finds from the temple at the sources of the Seine to the goddess Sequona, goddess of the Seine. And it's really unusual, for one thing, to find the entirety of the remains of one archaeological site in one museum. Usually they're scattered across, but just to have everything centralized in this one place was really, really remarkable. And I mean, the energy of having rooms and rooms of devotional items to this one goddess just together, as somebody who is, you know, sympathetic to those energies, who's been working as a polytheist for a long time, it was amazing. It was mind-blowing. Vivian Armstrong, who finally went to Dijon after I'd been promising to everybody that you should go to Dijon for years and years, went, and she said she just burst into tears. And that the museum docent was totally understanding, and that reaction happens a lot. I had no idea that there was a quote unquote, you know, Gaulish style of art that was distinctively Celtic that existed, because I had been under the impression that Humaniform versions of deity were not created by the Celts until after the Romans conquered. And so they were all very much in that model. So, and I discovered I was wrong. And that is what drove me into, exploring like, what are these connections? Where did this art come from? Because I really had no idea that there was Mediterranean contact so early before the Romans, that there was this whole genre of art that was Gaulish, that was distinctively Gaulish, that existed. And it kind of broke my mind, honestly. And it set me on this I must find out more path that I've been on for a dozen years. Châtillon-sur-Seine, home of the Lady of Geese. This is a princely burial, except it's actually a princess burial of a woman who had the largest wine mixing bowl in all of the world. I believe that the crater is the largest wine mixing ceremonial vessel anywhere found. Greek, which implies that she was very rich, but you can see for scale, this is a big deal. And if we're going to talk about sculpture here for a moment, in the early 1990s, a square enclosure some 20 meters high, visible on aerial photographs, drew the attention. On aerial photography attracted the attention of archaeologists. It was found near the tumulus in which the tomb of the Lady of Geese was discovered, in the valley of the Seine at the foot of Mount Lassois. The excavation, directed by B. Schom and W. Reinhardt, revealed a space surrounding a central pit. The entry of the space opened in the direction of Mount Lassois. In the pit were two statues that had each lost its head. One represented a seated warrior with a shield. The other was a woman, also seated, wearing around her neck a torque, terminating in two balls.
That's Celtic, for sure.
Archaeologists interpret the square enclosure as a sanctuary oriented towards the rich tomb and the settlement of Mount Lassois, in which these statues were placed. The form of the jewelry ornamented the neck. The neck of the female statue strongly resembles the torque placed in the tomb of the Lady of Geese. This resemblance to the Grand Lady can be interpreted as a sign of apotheosis. Part human and part goddess, nonetheless, the change of era did not spare her. This effigy and her companion were decapitated and laid low just before the middle of the 5th century BCE. Sculpted in soft limestone, which easily crumbles, these headless statues seem modest, yet they are one of the rare examples of large-scale humaniform sculpture in the round at the end of the Hallstatt era, 500 to 400 BCE. New evidence of the importance of the Lady of Geese in the culture of her time. And this is a picture of the sanctuary grounds. This is a picture of the torque in question. It is one that was found in the burial mound. It is, if you look to the right, decorated with tiny pegasi, and it is believed to be a Greek import. So it is, again, not native, but it is a Celtic style torque. And you can see the torque similarities on the statue, which is one of the ones in question. And here are her companions. So we're talking 500s BCE that these things were found. And that is, it was another museum where I was just like walking around stunned and babbling, because honestly, I had no idea that these statues exist. I came to see the torque. I came to see, the crater, but to just walk and find these statues was just, it was another one of those things where you're like, oh my God, I'm following this track that actually has, substance to it. This is really meaningful. Yay, gods, thank you for not making me feel like I'm doing a wild goose chase here for no reason. And it was a cart burial. Here's a a picture of a model of how the lady was found. And very near the museum is the sources of the Dewey. The Dewey is a very, very, very short river that doesn't flow very far at all before it flows into the Seine. It is a sacred site in its own right and prominent usage earlier than the sources of the Seine itself, although in a much more limited manner than the temple that developed there. It continued in folk usage and took on a connection with the Virgin Mary, and offerings continued on there at least until the 700 CE. It's a very beautiful place. So the sources of Seine, that is literally part of the spring, does not look nearly as impressive as the sources of the Dewey. And here's an illustration of the large temple complex that was excavated there. As I mentioned, though, it's interesting that this temple, which is to a Gaulish goddess, it is to Sequona. She is not Sequona Minerva or anything. She is just Sequona, is after the era of Roman political conquest. So it is perhaps something where we look at this temple and there may be Celtic elements in this practice, but honestly, we look at the source of the Dewey and we don't see anything like that here. So we're left kind of thinking, so the Romans perhaps came and said, there's a healing goddess here. We completely believe in this healing goddess. Let's build her a bigger temple. And they built it in, I say Romans. So Romanized Gauls decided that they found out that there were temples to water goddesses. Maybe they're like, we have a wonderful water goddess. We want to build her a temple. And so they built one in Gaul to a Gaulish goddess, but on more of a Roman model. It's thought that this temple had sleeping quarters, for example, as we hear about in the temples of Asclepius in Greece. It certainly has some resemblance to the temples at Bath, as far as we know. Really, at Bath, we have mostly the Bath section excavated. The temples section is very much less excavated, although there's been a lot of work done there in recent years, which is really, really interesting. And if you've been to Bath before, but not recently, I encourage you to go back. And so this is very much illustrating the dynamism of the Gaulish adoption and adaptation of Mediterranean concepts, the sleeping temples of Asclepius, the healing temples at Bath. And so,
Come on, Mickey.
So really, you know, you can see how there's a lot of things that go into this temple, and it's not just Roman. Here is a statue of the Matroni. That's kind of the larger part of my presentation, but I'm going to go on a little bit into my own personal work here. So this is a statue of the Matroni, and they are attested across the Roman Empire. In particular, they were focused in Germania, and they're first seen there after the Roman conquest. There's a lot of material in Bonn and in Cologne about the Matroni, and many of the Matroni have what is called ubii garments. There's a very strict standard, this is how the garments look, there's a standard headdress, and that is not depicted here. I personally work with the Matroni in more of a Cisalpine Gaulish modality, which is less attested but does exist, and where we have a multiplicity of female entities. The Matroni, in short, are kind of, I consider them to be a collective deity in the Etruscan model, which is part of why I have worked with them in kind of the Cisalpine Gaulish methodology. So Etruscan collective deity is a situation where you have a title, the Matroni, the ladies, essentially. Matroni means ladies, not mothers. And you don't necessarily know all of who are in this group. There's perhaps a representative or, one who speaks for the group. But it could be a goddess, it could be an ancestor, it could be a nymph, it could be a genius loci, it's just a number of entities with a certain interest in a particular thing that work collectively, but their identities aren't important. It's the collective identity that's important. To maybe give a clearer idea of what that is, there are several gods in the Etruscan pantheon who can throw thunderbolts. It is not just Tinia, who is called the Etruscan equivalent of Jupiter. It is also Iuna Uni. It is also Minerva. And we don't know who else. We just know that there is a group of gods called the gods who can throw lightning, essentially. And they cannot do so unless they have received permission from a council of gods who decides if they are allowed to throw lightning. There are different kinds of lightning bolts. There's one that's just sort of like a warning to be like, hey, knock that shit off, or I'm gonna turn this chariot around. There is, like, this is property destruction, but it doesn't hurt anybody. And there's like, I am going to destroy you personally. And there's, I'm sending you a sign. There are all these different kinds of thunderbolts, and only the warning one can be thrown without permission of the deconsentes, which are the consenting gods. And we know some of who the deities who are in the deconsentes, and we don't know some of them. But basically, the gods of the thunder and lightning cannot throw lightning until the gods of consent have said, yes, this seems like a justifiable way to do things. You have permission to throw that. So in that way, Tinia is a god who has the ability to throw thunderbolts, and he's probably also on the council of the gods who decide when it's okay to throw them. And he probably has to recuse himself when it's a question of whether he is going to do it. But these are the groups. These are the kinds of collective groups that we see in Etruscan mythology. And part of it is that they don't want to insult or leave anybody out. There is a tendency in early Italic religion to basically say, to all of these named gods, any unnamed gods that I've forgotten, they really, really want to make sure that they are not inadvertently offending anybody by failing to include them. So they use more generalized ideas. And in my thoughts, the Matroni vary from person to person. Because ancestresses can be in the Matroni, but not everybody's ancestresses are the same ancestresses. Deities can go and be part of the Matroni. They can be like, hey, I'm going to be supportive of you in this role. I'm not just doing it as me, I'm doing it as part of this group. There are all kinds of different entities that can be in the Matroni, and it's easier to refer to them as an amorphous, self-defining organization and to say thank you or please, and not try to be too particular about who you are speaking with. And in the Northern Europe, the Matroni cult gets really well known through inscriptions by soldiers and what have you. And they are all kind of like the Matroni of this particular tribe, the Matroni of those who look after boatmen, the Matroni of those who are in childbirth. There are all these very specific, epithets of Matroni where you can be very, very specific about the Matroni that you wish to call upon in your case. So if you are in Britannia on Hadrian's Wall and you are sick, you might pray to the Matrona of your tribe back in, Pannonia. And if you get better, you might make a inscription to say, thank you, goddesses, positive female entities of my tribe who like look after people and care for them. Thank you for helping me get through this illness. So we have all these epithets from across the Northern Empire, but in Cisalpine Gaul, they generally just get called the Matronae. And I personally have really found that just even trying myself to use an epithet, River Devora had suggested the epithet of the Matronae Hestiae. So the Matronae of the hearth at home. And I thought about using that and it did not feel right. It felt very much like I need to leave Matronae to define which Matronae they're going to be. It's a more nebulous concept. So these are less obvious Matronae. They don't have the standard Ubian, but they have a patera here. They have some cornucopias. Here is a rare 4-person sculpture of the Matronae. Many times you'll see them as 3. That's the majority of times. But I don't take that to be a question of triplicity. I take that as a means of conveniently and conservatively, sculpturally depicting many, unknown many. Because if you have 2, you have this, whole dyad, do these deities have a particular interaction with each other? Are these individuals? But if you have, 3 or more, you get this many. Dread, I thought I had kept another slide in here. It was a sculpture from the British Museum that says, thank you to the Matronae of Cisalpine Gaul and Germania and Gallia and Lugdiensis and Italy, and just it gave a list of all these Matronae they were thanking, which is from all these regions, which is implicating the sense of a multiplicity of multiplicities. I keep on flipping here. So we'll go here. So this is my domestic shrine. It's prominently placed in the main entry reception area of the house, right by the hearth. It's open to the room. It's not glassed in. This is very much, I adopt this very much from the Roman model, honestly. We have found many, many sculptures of shrine statues in Gaul that imply that they were having domestic shrines that were based on the practices that we know of from Italy. So this seems like a ritual tech that was exported and that I have no compunction to compunction from using. It's something that was adopted across a lot of Europe, and so that is how mine is set up. I do have a perpetual flame keeping practice in which I use electric candles and I relight them perpetually. So they're always burning. And that's my main offering. I make offering of keeping the light alive to these deities. I pray to them every night. And I've been doing it for more than 6 years now. So this is something that is the core of my personal practice. Here is a statue of the Matronae. And I really am glad that I was able to find a statuette that had the very stylized features. You can see in the back a postcard from of a relief of the Matronae from the museum at Châtillon-sur-Seine, which I sat and meditated in front of for a while. And I take that postcard often when I'm traveling as part of my traveling shrine. And this reminds me that I also associate the Matroni with the Disir, which is a later Scandinavian concept of collective female ancestors. I don't think that everybody should necessarily connect the Disir with the Matroni. I feel like in my case, I do have some level of Scandinavian heritage. And so I probably do have Disir, and I incorporate them into the Matroni because that is what happens to work for me. If somebody doesn't have any Scandinavian background and they have not been called to work with any Scandinavian ancestors, probably it doesn't make sense for them, but it does for me. Let's see. This is my shrine to Lugos and Sequona. And I work with him. Again, when we're looking at collective deities, there's this concept of Lugoves, which I think is more attested in Iberia, but it implies a multiplicity of faces of Lugos, perhaps just a multiplicity of embodiments of Lugos. I know that people work with Lugos much differently than I do, and I am very clear about working with Lugos of Lugudunum or Lyon. And he has traits that are associated with that city for me. I don't associate him explicitly with Mercury. I think he has some traits that are more honestly from Hermes than Mercury, given the river trade and Massilia, because Lyon is founded just upstream of Massilia and became a huge trading post for the empire. And I work with him in a consort pair with Sequona, the goddess of the river Sun, which flows into the Rhone at Lugudunum. And this is not attested. This is not an attested pairing. Sequona is attested as a goddess. She is known to be the goddess of the river Sun. Gods who are of the Mercury type are sometimes seen as having multiple consorts depending on location. River goddesses are very often seen as sovereignty deities that are valuable for such, incoming, deities who are more masculine and more in the range of abstract qualities to connect with in order to manifest bounty and prosperity in a certain area. So again, this is one of those gnosis. It is plausible. There are examples of this happening before. These deities on some level are believed to exist. There is no reason to think that they were not consorts here. And that is what my gnosis tells me. So I will completely 100% say this is just my interpretation. It is not historically attested. It's historically plausible, but here's where, I study extensively. My scholarship tries to do what it can to make this plausible and as authentic as possible, but it is a leap in the dark. Here you see actually an archaic Greek statue of Hermes, which when I saw it, I thought he looks very Gaulish. And so I brought it home, and then I found it later. I found the original later in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, labeled as archaic Greek. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense. And the Sequona statue that I have is actually a rededicated one of the goddess Pomona. who is an Italic goddess of fruits and harvest. But the interesting thing is that Pomona is perceived as more associated with apples. And this statuette has grapes. And the Saône is a river that flows through Burgundy and has a lot to do with both wine cultivation and and wine trade. And so I have adopted this statue. I've got a little raven and a little plush lynx because those are animals that are associated with Lugos. And this is my Cathabodua shrine. I do not have, Cathabodua is a goddess who is attested on one altar found up in the Alps. A lot of my work with her is based on gnosis. A lot of my work with her is based on some comparative studies with other Corvidine war goddesses. So I have a raven staring at a skull as my space, my altar for her, because I did not find that there was a statue of, say, the Morrigan that fit. And so I went with I will go with something that represents something that is, that feels true to my experience of this deity, even though it's not humaniform. So that is my shrine. And that was the last slide of my presentation.
Thank you so much. It was fantastic. Let me stop the recording.